Why We Cannot Fathom MA, a Socio-Philosophical Critique. A presentation originally presented at the Unbroken art exhibition in Amsterdam on the 3rd of May 2026. In this talk, I will present a couple of excerpts from the German language book that I'm writing together with my colleague, Emeritus Professor Jean-Pierre Wills, which we are expected to have finished by the summer and then will be published a few months later. Now, the question is why we cannot fathom MA. As an ethicist and social philosopher, I argue that this is not only due to contemporary post-pandemic societal ignorance, political denial, and biomedical neglect, as if that wasn't enough, but rather because ME is actually questioning our Western fundamental collective and individually internalized assumptions about ourselves, so our very nature of the self. And I call these assumptions the individual malleability syndrome, or rather the you can make it if you try syndrome, which are themselves rooted in the decline of the welfare state and the rise of hyper-individualism and positive psychology. This was basically the context also within which the BioPsychoSocial model arose and became particularly pertinent and dominant. And this is a model, of course, that many people, including myself, have criticized for its unethical effects, particularly on ME patients, as I will also explain later in this talk. But I think it's really important then also to realize that the biopsychosocial model is in fact not an aberration, but rather a natural outgrowth of Western, everyday, late modern, hyper-individualistic life, whereby we have a particular atomistic understanding of the self. And that precisely because it's this natural outgrowth, this is why it's so difficult to address. Now, let me first start with basically explaining a little bit about what I mean with the you can make it if you try syndrome. The intellectual roots of this you can make it if you try or if you put in your effort, etc., that lies roughly in the 19th century, when in the wake of the Enlightenment we really start to see a rise of individualism, whereby the individual is the unity or the unit of reason. And although such individualism has been criticized by many intellectuals also throughout history, it was particularly embraced also by German Romantic philosophers who thought of the individual as unique, as something that had to be brought to self-realization, to self-manifestation. And it's really this idea also of the self almost as a project that has to manifest itself in the world that then started to dominate social and political thinking about the self and became also practice in the world. And though one might say that, you know, we are currently living in a sort of anti-enlightenment era, and when you look at international politics or whatever, individualism as such has been socially internalized to such an extent that it is a prevailing interpretive framework for which people in the contemporary West generally understand the world. And socially speaking, individualism just does also gain strength when societies increasingly freed themselves from more traditional forms of authority during the 1960s and 70s. And here I also use the example of the Netherlands, where it was in the 1960s and 70s that people really started to free themselves from these different structures of the church. So Dutch society was very much pillarized, whereby it was, you know, your particular belief, your particular political affiliation that would determine, the leaders of those affiliations would determine basically your life. And with the freeing of the self from these more traditional forms of authority in the 1960s, 70s, the emphasis increasingly was laid on personal lifestyle and choices. So it was really about this freedom of the self or self-expression, the self as a project. But then 10 years later, roughly, so in the 80s, we see what I call hyper-individualism. And this was a direct result of the further erosion of the welfare state and the neoliberalization of society, in which an atomistic, individualistic approach became very central. And here it was really the notion that, or the assumption that you can do it if you, or you can make it if you try, that gained more and more ground and became very dominant. And so the upshot of this also is that those who didn't make it were increasingly regarded as not as fellow citizens deserving our social care, but rather as illegitimate burdens or burdensome people who simply didn't try and thus were not worthy of our attention and social care. And the context for this is, of course, that in the 1980s, what we see is a increasing outsourcing of government affairs and public services to private companies and enterprises. So we see that there's this hyper-individualization that comes together with the decline of the welfare state. So the individual is supposed to really make it much more on their own. And healthcare in this sense became increasingly subject also to cost-cutting hyper-individualization, with health being increasingly seen as a matter of individual responsibility, where an emphasis was laid on lifestyle modification and lifestyle choices. So mindfulness, mind-body approaches, yoga, exercise, healthy eating, responsibility for health was increasingly placed on the individual, and health was seen less as a public collective good and increasingly something that the individual should have control over. So self-management and individual resilience were basically also the terms under which cost-saving measures were implemented. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, I'm not against healthy eating or such matters, but we should note here that this individualization of health also leads to the vulnerable in society basically bearing more and more of the burden. So those who are literally weak, sick, nauseous, etc., they became responsible for their own misery, and not only that, also for solving their own misery through these other approaches. So this is really ethically questionable because it ensures, amongst other things, that society can wash its hands of social and collective responsibility and thus feeds social indifference. Now, the reason that MA is so difficult to fathom in this sense is because I think, anyway, that it challenges this very idea of individual responsibility. As a serious ME patient, there is very little to manage yourself, and you are basically at the mercy of the whims of your body. Moreover, activating lifestyle approaches are problematic for ME patients. In people with post-exertional malaise, any sense of activation can basically lead to severe long-term and structural physical deterioration rather than improvement. And that is, of course, this post-exertional malaise, by which we mean the significant and long-lasting worsening of symptoms with often, basically it's a very disproportionate worsening of symptoms that happens 28 to 48 hours or, 3 days after the very slightest emotional, cognitive, or physical exertion. And so, also contrary to what a large number of very expensive health coaches would like to tell us, ME is not curable by lifestyle changes. In the best scenario, it does not get worse or it remains stable. And let's also mention here something else in this context, and that's the post-cold pandemic individual responsibility. So, in the case of a contagious, potentially very disabling infection, such as SARS-CoV-19, the responsibility for protection falls increasingly and entirely on the shoulders of the individual by mostly wearing FFP2 masks, which protect still the best as one of the cheese layer protections. However, especially in European countries, and in this case I was particularly referring to the Netherlands in this talk, it is not socially accepted, and it is treated with daily verbal and physical violence. And then the question becomes, to what extent is individual responsibility still tenable in the context of such violence? Now, I could say a lot more about this, but because of the limited time, I basically would like to now go to the German philosopher Andreas Reckwitz, who argues in his book Verlust that since the 1960s and 70s, or since late modernity, we've become so focused on self-management, self-resilience, and strength that we are both collectively and individually less well equipped to deal with loss. And instead, we push the idea of vulnerability, death, physical vulnerability, etc., away. This is also what the German sociologist in a different context had called externalization, by which we actively deny or externalize vulnerability. And in doing so, not only impose this vulnerability onto others through our actions, but also then blame those others and those affected. We cover up such externalization to maintain our own illusion of normalcy. And as Andreas Reckwitz also explains, such externalizing behavior is also rooted in a illusory modernist belief in progress, in which the individual but also collective life should go upward and forward. It is the simple assumption that, it should somehow get better. Things ought to get better, right? And in this context, stagnation or decline not only becomes implausible, but it becomes unacceptable. So any chronic illness, but ME in particular, basically challenges this denialist behavior and the assumption of progress. For some patients, things might get better very slowly, but most will actually remain as sick as they are, and quite a few will gradually or very quickly deteriorate. So most of the patients are basically stuck. They're imprisoned by the disease. And many ME patients are therefore also in a state that they place somewhere in between life and death, with this notion of living death. Jan Lucas Lauer and I are also researching this concept of living death through an MBO-funded research project at the Radboud University. So more will also follow on that in due course. ME poses basically a fundamental challenge to society's assumption of progress, that things have to get better, right? We have to get on and we have to get better. And also it particularly challenges that assumption with regards to viruses and infections, which are regarded as, well, they're just part of life and, they will pass. In ME, it becomes very clear that so infectious-based ME, we also have to understand here there's a large section of ME that also happens due to non-infectious issues, such as cervical instability or other issues. So just to be clear, but for the infectious-based ME, it really challenges also that assumption that infections will pass, because actually no infections might just keep you there. They might keep you there stuck. So it really challenges this also untenable, largely Westocentric Europe assumption. And I think also the untenability of this assumption becomes very clear when we think of other infections, such as Ebola or HIV, because as a SARS, and also when we think of even the SARS virus, whatever the prevailing view might be in society today, it is not a cold, even though it might be experienced by some people as a cold. The damages and things that it does, and in the way it functions and its mechanisms, it cannot be compared to an ordinary respiratory disease. Yet this idea of progress, that things have to get better and that there's an upwards trajectory, is not only prevalent, but also has since the 1970s taken a particular or a special turn. namely through the conviction that progress can be achieved not through radical material changes or social structural alterations in terms of justice, but rather through the mind or the psyche. And it's in this context also of the gradual decline of the welfare state and the rise of neoliberalism that psychology basically emerged as a discipline and really strengthened also as a discipline for solving particular economic and political and social crises, right? So psychology was increasingly turned to as the discipline that then had to provide answers and basically get people back on track, so to speak. And this is something that my colleague Olel Treibe and I will be researching as part of another project. But in any case, it led more and more to the notion of the self as a therapeutic project. And the culmination of this movement is actually we find in positive psychology, which was launched in the 1990s by Martin Seligman, and it played an important role in public culture. So he really launched this idea of positive thinking and the self-help book. So he really advocated for the self-help industry, which we then also saw through talk shows such as Oprah Winfrey, right, which really took a very strong, like a positive psychology approach that basically the assumption there is that you can significantly change or adjust your reality by thinking positively. Now, positive psychology, I argue, is basically the ultimate manifestation of this "you can make it if you try" syndrome. Because positive psychology, or positive thinking, rather, was supposed to not only bring you health, but also wealth. And it was particularly actually focused on the latter. If you think positively, the riches will come to you. And such were these mottos of authors and people like Seligman and the self-help culture. Now, as a philosopher, I certainly do not want to prescribe to people what or how they should think, but it is my job to raise a few critical questions here. And Barbara Ehrenreich and also other scientists have pointed out that scientific research in this area is not only methodologically and epistemologically flawed, but that there is also no convincing link actually between positive thinking and the outcome of a disease. And positive thinking is definitely and certainly not a cure. So just as my thoughts that the sky is purple cannot change that the sky is blue, or in fact most often grey, it also cannot change the course of disease. However, it became so popularized, this notion that one can determine, one's outlook by thinking positively, that it became very much embroiled and embedded in everyday thinking and everyday life. And in doing so, it creates a certain normative pressure in which the lack of positive physical results then also can mean that you have not thought positively enough, with all the stigmatizing consequences that it entails. And so philosopher Susan Sontag also explained that beneath positive psychology lies a "you can make it if you try" myth, which basically results directly into victim blaming. Patients did not get better because they were suppressed, they were inhibited, they failed to fight the disease by thinking positively. And it's this idea also, this notion, and we've maybe forgotten about this, but the psychologization of illness is not limited to just ME or post-viral illnesses, but also gave rise to the notion of a cancer personality, or that MS patients were mainly hysterical. So people were blamed for their illness because they were supposed to have the wrong state of mind, for example, because they were stressed or perfectionistic. Now, the issue here is that, of course, the other side is never highlighted, namely how many people are also stressed or perfectionistic that don't get any illness, right? So the problem is that it's epistemologically and methodologically flawed, but the problem is also that, as Susan Wendell has said, that this kind of stigmatizing thinking entails a false belief in the myth of control, namely the belief that one has the power to fully control the life of the body. or rather that one has the power to fully control life as such, because the body is the means through which we live. And that, as I will say, has particular disastrous ethical consequences. It has disastrous consequences because it puts the blame directly on ME patients, but also subjects them to harmful treatments, which we will talk about in a second. But for now, I also want to highlight that ME might actually be one of the main challenges precisely to this myth of control, that we have control over our lives, because especially in PEM, so post-exertional malaise, patients have to deal or are confronted with complete unpredictability often, and complete uncontrollability. Rather, they are delivered over to the body. And in ME, it then becomes very clear that it's not the individual will that determines our fate in life, but rather that our will has the functioning body as its precondition, which is also something that, of course, we can find in the writings of French philosopher Merleau-Ponty. And so when we look at it this way also, this whole notion which is tied to positive psychology of fighting a disease, through positive thinking and through whatever, right? The notion of fighting a disease becomes very problematic. And this is also something that, again, Susan Sontag has highlighted in her works. It is always very problematic in relation to chronic illness, but particularly in ME, it really reaches a level of absurdity. Such metaphors are extremely violent, because if there is one thing that ME patients should not do, in a sense, it is fighting, because ME involves effort. ME also involves effort. I mean, fighting involves effort. And in ME, the effort will most likely lead to structural deterioration in the physical condition. It will lead to PEM, which for many basically feels like dying without the relief of death. And it is also for that reason that it is particularly so absurd that ME patients are actually forced to fight, usually online, for the recognition of their illness. Indeed, it is really a great injustice that those who are so sick, so excluded, so isolated and marginalized have to fight for recognition, often with severe and long-lasting physical consequences. And the question here is, when will other people stand up? When will other people who are normally also so preoccupied, for instance, with other aspects of social justice, stand up for ME patients? The problem here is that ME is so invisible and also doesn't have, in that sense, yet a social justice status, that it's even pushed more into this invisibility. And the question here then is also, when can we finally break through this wall of individualistic indifference? So the one thing that didn't help in this respect is the BioPsychoSocial model. And apologies, the title is still of this slide is still in Dutch. It should just basically read the BioPsychoSocial model. Because rather than highlighting, these structures actually of social justice, what it did is that it placed actually the full responsibility on the individual itself, because it actually adopts a very much an individualistic approach, to which I will say a little bit more later on. So critics like myself have often, and also others and colleagues have criticized the biopsychosocial model because it's been harmful to patients and also hampered biomedical research, but we've actually failed to, often at least, to take this broader context of hyper-individualization into account. And yet, I think that is a particular key, because it's this hyper-individualization that makes it very difficult to address the biopsychosocial model and to address the injustices that ME patients find themselves in. So what is the biopsychosocial model anyway? So many people trace it back to the works of George Engel from 1977, in which he criticized medical reductionism, which reduced disease to a biomedical perspective. Instead, he proposed what he called an holistic model, whereby the biological, social, and psychological components would be united in the study of the causation of disease. Now, that's also an important aspect. So the issue here is that it's about causation. Now, it all sounds very nice, but the problem is, of course, that basically the merging of biological, social, and psychological is in a sense nothing less than what one would say is an open door, right? Is in like it's a truism. Everything we do encompasses all these domains. What his model then did not do, and what's also been criticized by plenty of people already, is clearly define these domains and indicate exactly how they are causally related to each other. And so, scientifically speaking, using the BPS model, one cannot distinguish between causal, correlative, and false correlative relationships. And this means that much of the research, and there is a lot of it, is guided by the assumptions of the person or institutions carrying out the research, and the results of which then are not surprisingly, again, confirm these assumptions. And this is basically also what we in scientific circles call, is basically a classic case of bullshit in, bullshit out problem. Now, it's also not important to mention here is that the BPS, not BPD, there's a mistake in the slide there, the BPS model does not offer, and here I want to be very clear, it does not offer a social criticism of unjust social structures. And it cannot do so because it looks at the social domain from an objectivating point of view, from the individual's internal psyche. That is to say, it looks from within. So it looks at social structures from within the psychological processes of the individual. So it remains imprisoned in an individualistic, hyper-individualistic perspective, rather than being able to address social structures and other issues for which we would actually need a much more sociological account that is based on intersubjective methods and epistemological perspectives. So it cannot actually function and criticize unjust social structures because it always looks at social issues from within the internal perspective of the individual. And therefore, it's not just a case that the BPS model is, say, falsely applied. No, it's basically a non-workable model. Anyway, the conceptual and epistemological vagueness of the model not only made it nonsensical, but also dangerous. And later proponents of the biopsychosocial model, such as Waddell and Aylward, basically told ME patients that they were not suffering from a real illness, but from a self-constructed illness, from a real disease, but from a self-constructed illness experience, for which they themselves were held responsible. People, and therefore patients, basically, they said, have their lives in their own hands, and which is why Waddell and Aylward also portrayed patients as people who fake it, so people who simulate their illness. They're not actually ill because it's not biomedically objectifiable, as they say, and therefore their illness is not real. And they are said to, so patients, they argue, are out for illness gain. So their main goal is just illness gain. They act in a selfish manner, and what they want is free financial support and attention. And so the thinking went, patients had to be forced into action out of their laziness, particularly through work and gradual exercise therapy. Here it's also interesting again because Waddell and Aylward, they were also themselves very much engaged in or played a key role in the cutting of social welfare or disability entitlements and payments for the British government at that time. So they wanted to cut the welfare state directly and cut the costs, and this is why they came up with this model, which again points to the fact that this BPS model really is, in a sense, also the outflow of this this political context wherein we see the rise of individualism and reduction of the welfare state. They basically said that patients have to keep going, and even if they were in pain, the illness could not be objectified, and thus the pain was not real, which meant that patients were forced to follow cognitive behavioral therapy programs in which they were told to think positively, because also any negative thoughts or thinking about your illness at all is basically what kept you sick. So it wasn't your illness that kept you sick, you yourself kept yourself sick. And this is, of course, what we still also see replicated in a lot of these mind-body programs and other things that are, you can attend online or, be part of for several hundreds of euros. It basically tells you that, if you change your thoughts, you can change your illness, which is unfortunately way too simplistic. The problem is also that it caused a lot of damage. It basically meant that biomedical research was sort of halted or did not really get off the ground. It also led to the severe physical deterioration of patients, including even permanent bedriddenness and sometimes even death. It also led to a lot of psychological damage amongst patients because they were now themselves to blame. It led to the internalization of guilt, for instance. It also led to social consequences, whereby other people were basically saying, "Now you see these people, they are just themselves to blame." So it led to a reduction in social solidarity. But of course, as there is more recently, a little bit more biomedical research coming up, the BPS researchers have recently started to change their tone somewhat. And so they started to, in the Netherlands, they call this ALK, so aanhoudende lichamelijke klachten, which basically means persistent physical symptoms. And here they now acknowledge that there is a physical cause, so an infection or a trigger, but again, it's not the infection or trigger is what keeps you ill, rather it's your exaggerated response to that trigger that basically keeps you in that state. So it's a fear of movement or the deconditioning or the lack of positive thinking, etc., that drives the illness still forward, rather than persistent immune reactions or viral replications or metabolic changes, etc. And insofar as that there are immune reactions, then really these people say it would be part of your own doing to undo that through positive thinking, through relaxation, etc. In other words, basically, these changes, they're just sort of like hermeneutical changes. They're a beautiful packaging of the same unethical and scientifically problematic content. And now I think we have to be very clear here, is that the BPS model and the psychologization of particularly ME is one of the biggest medical ethical and social ethical scandals of the last few decades, but very few dare to acknowledge it as such. And I think that is because it fits so well into the myth of our neoliberal zeitgeist, so the individualistic myth in which we as individuals are in control of and therefore responsible for our lives. The BPS model is strongly rooted in these assumptions and also really reproduces these assumptions. And that is precisely also why it is so difficult to combat, because these myths are ingrained and becoming even more ingrained in all layers of society. So you find them, for instance, in small micro encounters, like a neighbor who says, "Oh, are you still not back at work? Have you tried sports or yoga? Because really you have to get off that couch or out of that bed." But also there was a long COVID conference in the Netherlands recently, whereby again there was this plethora of mind-body approaches presented, which basically echo the assumptions that I denounced above. Or the Dutch Ministry of Health, which basically urges individual responsibility and neoliberal notions of individual resilience, and also how they increase the individual risk payments that people have to pay into their insurance, whilst at the same time cutting healthcare. And so my conclusion is that we have failed to understand ME because it challenges us to let go of the fundamental myths in our society. The hyper-individualism, the idea of progress, that we have control over our own lives. It forces us to face our intersubjective existential vulnerability, which basically means that we no longer externalize or that we should no longer externalize ME and also other post-infectious syndromes, but also the forces or the parts of ME or the types of ME that are not caused by infectious syndrome, but rather, say, cervical instability. We have to recognize that such issues can happen to us at any given time. And really, we ought to focus on our intersubjective existential vulnerability and build structures and relations of solidarity. And that's where we need to be, rather than through mind-body approaches, through by BS model, etc. That's not the way forward.